if you can represent the people you didn't like anyway in the culture war as literally being people who might kill you, right? Then you've got double incentive to sort of push them out of the conversation. And that's the most frightening thing about this for me. This stuff that, you know, you hear this all the time, you know, you are literally killing people by not taking this vaccine. I mean, you might just be sitting at home in your little house avoiding everyone and just minding your own business, but the fact that you haven't had a medicine means you're a murderer. Well, if you think people are genuinely murderers, then you can justify doing almost anything to them. And that's the disturbing thing. So
well, thanks for that. I mean, one of the things that I find is challenging for, let's say, those that, I don't know, follow the narrative, the capital N, is that they seem to have a really remarkably hard time faithfully rendering the other side. And again, this may or may not be your experience, but this is what I found, is that I can occupy sort of faithfully the concerns of the other side, I feel, right? I can say, okay, I understand. Like, I think that if you know, the science around this is correct, and that the less people that get vaccinated, the more chance for mutations or the more chance of harm. Like, okay, I understand your concerns. I may come to some different conclusion about them. But by and large, what I've found is it seems much more rare that that side is able to faithfully occupy the concerns of the, quote, other side. And there's something to that, which I think also like distorts the capacity for coming to some sort of contact. But I also wonder, for both of you, and maybe Paul first, is that, yeah, what have you found in terms of that dilemma, like being able to name, you know, this narrative with a capital N, but it seems to be almost like those that occupy it, it's so pervasive that it's actually impossible to see, which is, again, it's a kind of privilege to occupy a narrative position, which is the, you know, the quote norm.
Yeah, it's a good question. Here's something really interesting. So I remember seeing an opinion poll in America a while back. In fact, there have been a few of these about how liberals and conservatives see each other. And Jonathan Haidt, the psychiatrist, has done quite a lot of work on this. Psychologist, sorry. In his book, The Righteous Mind, I think he talks about this, and in a few other places. And when they ask conservatives and liberals both to describe the position of the other team, curiously enough, conservatives are much better at understanding liberals than liberals are at understanding conservatives. Now, I don't know quite why that is. He goes into a good deal of detail about that. But when liberals are broadly asked to characterize conservative positions, they're not really able to do it very well. But conservatives understand liberal positions. Now, I don't know whether that is because, broadly speaking, in America, liberalism is sort of dominant and conservatism is outside. I don't know. That might be wrong. And I presume it's different from place to place. But it's quite interesting. Now, you know, the COVID division is not political in that sense. Actually, in fact, the interesting thing about it is that it seems to go right across political divides. But it is, to some degree, playing into or fitting into these pre-existing culture war divides that were there already. And I think that's part of the reason it's so vicious. Interestingly, I mean, I live in Ireland, and we don't really have a culture war here of the kind that's going on in America, and to some degree is going on in Britain as well. I mean, there might be a bit of it in Dublin amongst the students, but there's not much of it out in the countryside. So, you know, people have arguments about vaccination, and you certainly get frowned on by many people if you're not vaccinated, but it doesn't feel like it's a giant existential culture war thing like, you know, Brexit or something like that. And it just strikes me that when you have that division, what you have very often, I mean, but certainly when you look at COVID, there's a mainstream narrative which we're asked to accept. And if you accept it, you don't really need to think about it very much. You just assume that it's true. You assume that what the media is saying is true, and what the government is saying is true, and you might not like it, you might grumble about it a bit, but you broadly assume, as you say, that the narrative is right. Okay, so you don't have to really question it very much. Whereas if you've gone outside the narrative and questioned it, whether you're right or not, okay, because as Charles accepts, we could all be wrong about things, and one thing that puts me on alert is anyone coming at me with any degree of certainty from either side. Actually, if somebody thinks they know exactly what's going on, that's probably something to be avoided. But if you've gone outside the narrative on COVID or anything else, you have to think about it more. And so you have to understand what the narrative is. You've probably come from the narrative in the first place. I mean, in my case, I've drifted away from the mainstream narrative because I don't really believe much of it. But I accepted it to start with mainly, and there's still parts of it that I accept. But if you're a dissident in any field, you have to understand what you're dissenting against. Whereas if you're not, you don't have to bother understanding the dissidents. And if you're hostile to the dissidents because you think that they're dangerous, then you're going to want to mischaracterize them deliberately. And I think there's obviously a mixture of deliberate mischaracterization and genuine misunderstanding, depending on who you're talking to. I mean, people who are very aggressively attacking people like Charles and me or anyone else who dissents from the narrative, very often they're being extremely dishonest about the things that they do. You know, we all know what the characterizations are. You're a conspiracy theorist, you're a fascist, you're a whatever. You know, there's a list of things that they come out with. There's an Irish journalist called Fintan O'Toole, very well-known journalist here, and he writes for the Irish Times, which is the sort of mainstream Dublin liberal paper. And he wrote a column a couple of weeks ago. It was appalling, actually. And the headline was, there are 3 types of anti-vaxxers. There are paranoids, fascists, and what was the other one? Paranoids, fascists, and egomaniacs, he said. And then he went on in the column hilariously to explain that we had to listen to the concerns of anti-vaxxers, otherwise we wouldn't be able to change their minds. So I thought that was probably a bad start. But I mean, that's the kind of deliberate mischaracterization that you get from some people. And every time somebody does something like that, it just hugely inflames the conversation completely pointlessly. And it's worth saying, of course, there are plenty of so-called anti-vaxxers who do the same thing, right? There are plenty of people on the other side who want to present the mainstream narrative as corrupted and the people who follow it as sheeple who haven't got minds of their own and all the rest of it. But yeah, I think broadly speaking, if you dissent from any mainstream position, you have to understand it to dissent from it. Whereas if you're attached to it, you don't have to bother understanding those who walk away. So yeah, there's that. But as I say, I think the pre-existing culture war divides in the West that were there already have attached themselves to COVID, and we've all kind of. If you can represent the people you didn't like anyway in the culture war as literally being people who might kill you, right? Then you've got doubled incentive to sort of push them out of the conversation, and that's the most frightening thing about this for me. This stuff that you hear this all the time. You are literally killing people by not taking this vaccine. I mean, you might just be sitting at home in your little house, avoiding everyone and just minding your own business, but the fact that you haven't had a medicine means you're a murderer. Well, if you think people are genuinely murderers, then you can justify doing almost anything to them. And that's the disturbing thing. So, yeah, it's like what we very much need to do is put a big bucket of cool water on this whole conversation. And but I don't know whether that will happen or not. But that's how it seems to me anyway.